Good day. I'm Daniela Ellerbeck, Legal Advisor to Freedom of Religion South Africa, commonly known as 4SA. And joining me in this week's discussion is 4SA's Executive Director, Michael Swain. Now, this week's topic is parental rights versus the state. Now, this is the right of parents to raise their children in accordance with their own beliefs and values. And this right has been seen as an essential element of how parents raise their children, but in some cases, this is now also under threat. Michael, why is there an issue regarding parents raising their children in accordance with their beliefs? Surely this is the right of the parents of the child and shouldn't even be in dispute.
Well, you absolutely like to think so, wouldn't you? But perhaps one of the most significant questions of our day is the question of parental rights. People of faith typically see your right to raise your own children as a sacrosanct relationship. You actually should have, and in fact do have, the inalienable right to raise your own child according to your own values and beliefs. But however, we live in an increasingly secular society where the state believes that, in fact, they should have the right to intervene and even potentially overrule if parents are not aligned with the views and values that they would like to teach your children. And, we see this trend, particularly in so-called Western nations, towards a growing level of state interference in the parent-child relationship. And, of course, where that manifests most often is in the area of education. The views and values of children are obviously very open to be molded in the first early years of development. There was that saying, which I'm sure you've heard, give me a child until the age of 7 and I'll show you the man. And children, obviously, at that early age, they have no filters. They can't really discern what they're being taught. And so therefore, if you can teach them, and let's look at a good example of this in the battle over who should teach children about sex and sexuality. What should they be taught? And sexuality then being the wide concept that includes things like their sexual orientation, gender identity, sexual rights, and that type of thing. Now, religious parents, so let's go back to the sort of, perhaps the ideological battle that happens here. They typically have pretty conservative views on this topic. They believe that they should have the right to teach their children. Whereas, of course, secular society has a very liberal view. Religious parents particularly tend to raise their children to view sex as special, as sacred, as reserved for marriage, as the consummation of the bond between one man and one woman, and of course then producing children and forming a family unit. And the priorities of that will prioritize typically modesty, moral purity, and of course the preservation of the traditional family structure. Now, the secular view, which is typically pushed increasingly by the state, view on that prioritizes sexual rights over sexual responsibility. And typically that will then embrace diverse sexual orientations and gender identities and gender expression. And often this is then rolled out into the schools through what we call comprehensive sexuality education, or CSE. And again, the reason given for this is that it's essential to empower girls to break down gender stereotypes, or it's essential to avoid early pregnancy in schools. And so there's always a good reason for it. But the result is the same. You have the state insisting increasingly that it overrides the rights of parents to teach their values to their own children.
And often, actually, the evidence shows that there's an increase in sexual violence and teenage pregnancies and abortion and so forth. So, Michael, can you give any recent examples of this conflict between parental rights on the one hand and state initiatives on the other?
We had a situation in 2019 where there was the rollout of a very liberal CSE materials that were planned in the form of scripted lesson plans and for teachers and for learners. And the material in it was very explicit. We took photographs and actually produced a PDF of exactly what was in those materials. And there was then significant pushback from parents, because parents typically, in that instance specifically, had neither seen nor been consulted on those materials. And again, we often say, follow the money if you want to see where things come from. And there was a significant funding for that particular program to the tune of R500 million by an international organization called USAID. So let me give you another example. Last year, for example, the South African government signed up for the so-called Education Plus initiative. that was launched by 5 UN agencies in 2019. And again, this hands over to these international agencies the power, the right to script what children will learn in our schools. And of course, that has been strongly criticized, particularly because that sexuality education that they're talking about was based on the highly controversial International Technical Guidance on Sexuality Education, the ITGSE, which of course was also funded and imparted in part by an organization called International Planned Parenthood, who are the world's largest abortion provider and sell baby parts and other horrors. So we have more and more examples of these things that are happening. Another example, perhaps, and let's maybe end with this one, is the WHO, the World Health Organization, which is an agency of the United Nations, largely unaccountable to the nations because 80% of its funding comes from philanthropic organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and some of the major pharmaceutical companies. But they've developed guidelines on sexual education for children, which they describe as minimal standards that need to be covered by sexuality education and a framework for policymakers and educational and health authorities. So these influences coming international impact and affect what gets taught in contexts and in nations and in cultures where the traditions can be completely opposite to what they're now trying to push as an agenda. But of course, when this comes into play, this then comes into our education system. So all in all, we're seeing this conflict between parental rights on the one hand and encroachment by the state on the other. And of course, one of the things that we 4SA do is we monitor very closely because we know that this deeply affects our constituency when parental rights, particularly the rights of parents to transfer their values and their faith and their beliefs to their children, is in fact being systematically eroded. But Daniela, maybe a question for you, because one of the things that we've always said, and is very much part of who we are, is that we are ideologically neutral in this matter, and we're only interested in what the law says. So maybe you could give us some now legal rationale why we should be concerned.
Michael, that is a very good question, because you're right, we are ideologically neutral. And I always think back on when the CSE hubbub first broke in the media, and you had an interview, I think it was with Stephen Grootes on SAFM, and he basically asked you why, people should be concerned about, or parents should be concerned about sexually explicit content, or something like that, something along those lines. And you said to him, well, if the state was teaching your child something that you fundamentally disagreed with, like let's say that you fell on the more liberal side of things and the state was teaching them that a very conservative view of abstinence only is the only way to go, and that was against your wishes, wouldn't you have a problem? And that kind of illustrates for me perfectly the fact that the state needs to be ideologically neutral in this, like where the parents' rights falls to raise their children in line with their own values and beliefs, and what the state's job is, and when they start encroaching. And it's not just when a liberal value system gets put onto children in the classroom. It would be the same for if a conservative value had to be put onto children. So, and actually our law states that schools must be ideologically neutral places too. And I'm thinking specifically of the Department of Basic Education's own education white paper 1, which spells out that parents and guardians have the primary responsibility for the education of their children and have the right to be consulted by state authorities with respect to the form that education should take and to take part in its governance. Now, parents have the inalienable right to choose the form of education which is best for their children, particularly in the early years of schooling, whether provided by the state or not, subject to, of course, reasonable safeguards, which may be required by law. Now, the parent's right to choose includes choice of language, cultural, or religious basis of the child's education, with due regard to the rights of others and the rights of the growing child. So parental rights are also protected in various international legal instruments and treaties that South Africa has ratified, and that's binding upon us. So international law that we said we agree to this, and therefore it becomes law in our country. And these state that parents have the prime responsibility regarding the upbringing of their children. For example, I'm thinking of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, commonly known as the ICCPR, which states that states undertake to have respect for the freedom of parents to ensure the religious and moral education of their children in conformity with their convictions. So again, we see that even in terms of the international law that South Africa said we agree to, that parents are the ones who are responsible for teaching their children their beliefs and values and raising them in line with these. Now,
yeah, Danielle, I think just to interject for a moment, I think one of the things that is absolutely clear, of course, is that while some subjects that are taught in school, like mathematics, that is a neutral subject in that sense. I mean, 1 + 1 will always equal 2. Those laws of mathematics are unchangeable. But when you're talking about sex and sexuality, and particularly when you start to bring in very perhaps controversial things like gender identity and sexual expression and that type of thing, and you start teaching them to little children, that can't possibly be, of course, a neutral position. There's always going to be some form of ideological bias when you start teaching on sex and sexuality. And therefore, of course, the question is, why are they trying to push this into schools in the first place? Surely this should be left out, and we should stick to the biology, if you like, of sex and sexuality.
Well, I think especially given the current literacy rate crisis, one could argue that go back to the fundamental basics. That's definitely an argument that I'm seeing a lot being raised in the public square and online. But Michael, now that we've highlighted some of the big issues in regards to parental rights, we've said what parental rights is, and we've also said, okay, where we see them coming in conflict with the state. Where can people find out more about this issue and follow other battles for faith and freedom that 4SA is fighting on behalf of the faith communities in South Africa?
Well, obviously, the best thing they can do is to watch our Facebook page, Freedom of Religion SA, go to our website, forsa.org.za, or look at our YouTube channel. You're watching this on the YouTube channel as well. But very specifically, when it comes to these issues, when it comes to the encroachment of these issues into schools, parents should be aware and alert to this, and they should be in contact with their school governing bodies, with the school management team, and engage with them to make sure that their rights to decide on the content of this type of education to their children in the schools where their children go are actually respected and reflect the values that they have. So very importantly, of course, to emphasize school governing bodies in this mix. They are, in a very real sense, the gatekeepers that will either say yes to this type of liberal material or choose alternative content so that the necessary outcomes specified by the CAPS curriculum requirements, which the state does have the right to do, are actually respected. So that's how we need to follow this. But follow it closely, because there is an increasing level of encroachment by the state in terms of the educational content that's coming into schools. And that is in direct conflict with parental rights and their rights to teach, and our rights as parents to teach our values to our own children.
All right. Thank you so much, Michael, for a very interesting discussion. Viewers, we hope you find it interesting as well. And until next time. Good day. This is Daniela Ellerbeck, the legal advisor to Freedom of Religion South Africa. Remember to like and share this video, and then click on the subscribe button to make sure you never miss our video updates on vital religious freedom issues.